What's going on, everyone? It's Chris from the tech team, and today we're going to get started with custom hooks in React.js. So today we're going to create our own custom hook, write it from scratch, and then we're going to be able to reuse this component, or this hook, sorry, throughout our application. So what I've done is I've created a React app, called it Custom Hooks Explained, and then I've gone ahead and installed React Router DOM as well. And all I've done is just create a very basic application which allows me to toggle between posts and users, and this will just load up whichever component, post, or users that we're on. So /posts / nothing, which is the home page, and users. So let me just load that up. If I'm on posts or users, it will render that data. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make an API call to both of these links, but I want to reuse the same hook across both pages. So let's just go ahead and get started. So what I want to do is, to make this API call, I'm first going to want to do something when this this component renders. And to do that, I want to use an effect. And by having an empty square bracket in here, this will render when this component renders. This in between this function will run. So if I say console.log posts have loaded, and then we obviously need to import our use effect. So I'm just going to go ahead and auto import that and save this. Come back to our window. Posts have loaded. I click on users, nothing happens. Come back to posts, and posts have loaded. Okay, fantastic. Now what I want to do is I want to go and fetch some data. And over here, what I've got is jsonplaceholder.typicode.com/posts, and I've got jsonplaceholder.typicode.com/users. And this is just a boilerplate, dummy data that I can just go away. I think this URL's got like to-dos on there as well. But we're just going to use the users and posts for today. So I'm going to take this URL. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to remove our console log, and I'm going to say fetch some data, then handle that data. So I want to handle the response. I want to get the response in JSON, and then I want to do something with that JSON. So I'm going to say console.log JSON. So I'm going to save that, come back to our application, and we see that we've got a list of posts from this URL now. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this exact same code, and I'm going to just replicate it across onto users. So over onto users, knock down a couple of lines. Instead of posts, we'll go into /users, and then we obviously need to make sure that we're importing use effect. So I'm just same again. I'm just going to auto import that, save, and if I come back to my application, let's just minimize this. When I load up users, I get 10 users. When I go back to posts, I get 100 posts, 10 users, and so on. So we know that this is working. Now what you'll see is we are repeating ourselves here. We've got use effect. We're doing pretty much everything the exact same on this page, on this component, as we are on this component. And as a developer, you should know that if you're repeating yourself, you're probably doing something wrong, or there's an easier way to solve this, to manage this code. So the dry principle is don't repeat yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new hook, which is a new file, and I'm going to save that in hooks. You don't have to save it in hooks. It's just convention to kind of, for me to store and make sure that I know exactly where my code is. So I'm going to put it in my hooks folder, and I'm going to call this use fetch. Now you'll notice that the name is use fetch. This can be anything that we want. We don't necessarily have to call it use fetch, but just like the React hooks all start with use, so use effect, use memo, use ref, and so on. We're going to carry on that convention, and we're going to say use fetch. So I'm going to create that, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to export defaults, and what I want to do is make sure that I'm exporting a function. So export defaults function, use fetch. And this is going to return, let's just return nothing for the time being. And this is going to take in a URL. So just like what we've got in our application, we want to use it on as soon as this gets loaded. So we need to use effect from React. And what I'm going to say, actually, I'm going to set some state as well. So let's say use state from React, and then I'm going to const data and set data is equal to use state, and let's just put null in here for the time being. And then I'm going to use that use effect. And I'm going to say when this application loads, we want to do something. However, it's not just when this application loads. We now have a dependency. Because we're going to be working with the URL within here, we need to make sure that our URL is in our dependency list. So whenever this updates or changes or whatever, this use effect will rerun and it will go fetch our data again. So now what I can say is console.log URL. I'm going to save that there for the time being. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return data from our state. So I know that we've not actually set any data right now, but I just want to show you how we actually grab this on the other side of our in our components. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to remove. Shall we remove it? Yeah, let's just remove our posts, and I'm going to say, let's get rid of that. I'm going to say const data is equal to use fetch, and then we obviously need to pass in a URL. So I'm going to make sure that we pass in something because we've not done any sanitization yet, and I'm going to import our use fetch. So use fetch from use fetch. Okay, so we're not doing anything with this right now because obviously all we're doing is returning nothing because our data hasn't been set. It's currently null. However, when this loads, because it's getting a URL, we should see console.log and the URL. So I'm going to save this, come back over to our application. I'm going to clear this out and reload. And we're on users, that's why. So right now, when I go to posts, we get the URL, which is what's getting passed all the way through. So we know that our component right now, this is hooked up to our use fetch. So now what we can do is go ahead and replicate what we were doing a moment ago, but just make sure that we've got some asynchronous calls, because an API call isn't synchronous. It can take some time for that data to be returned. So we need to set up an asynchronous call to make sure that we can go and fetch the data, and then we can return the data once it's been populated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some other state here, and this is what I like to do. I like to say loading and set loading, and I'm going to say this is false because it's not loading by default. And then I'm going to say, instead of duplicating up on data, I'm going to say error, and I'm going to say set error. So now, let's just leave it as null. Now what we can do is I can come back to our posts, and I can extract these out of use fetch as well. So I can say loading, and I can say error. Save that and come back. Now let's set up our asynchronous call, and I'm going to say const fetch data is equal to async, and then I'm creating a function within here because we need to call it separately. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, once we go into start fetching the data, I'm going to say set loading to true. Okay, next what I want to do is I want to go and fetch the data. So I'm going to say const res is equal to await fetch, and then the URL. So just like we had in our file over here, we fetch it and then we wait for a response. I'm just handling that slightly different because I want to await the results. And then I'm going to say const data is equal to await.res.json, because I want to wait for the results, and then I want to, .res, I want to wait for the results response, and then I want to make sure that the response is in JSON format. So then we've got a doubling up of our naming convention here. I don't want to mutate the state here, so what I'm going to say is content. And now I'm going to say set data is equal to content, and then finally set loading to false, because we've gone away, we've fetched the data, and now we've got it here. I'm going to save this quickly because we've still got some changes to make to this because I want to wrap everything in a try catch. And now what we need to do is make sure that we call this function, because this function is in useEffect, but it's not actually being instantiated. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say, once the URL changes, which is in our dependency list, I want to run fetch data, and that will run this asynchronous call, which will then await the results from the URL. So let's come back over here, clear out our window, load it up, and we've got no errors. That's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to our posts component, and in here I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to log data and save that. You know what? I'm going to log loading as well. So loading and loading, just so we can see what happens as it progresses. So loading is undefined, and have we exported that? We have not. So I'm going to make sure that we return that. So loading and error. I'm going to come back to our page, clear the window and reload. And so data is null, loading is false, data is null, then loading is true, and then data gets populated. And that's because as the application is rendering, it's just going through this process, and now it's fetching that data. So now we know that the data that we get back from useFetch is populated into a variable that we've got over here. So now we can do things in this page and say, like, if loading is true, render a loading component, otherwise render the data. And we'll do that in a moment, but let's just finish this off. So now, because we've got no kind of error handling around this, what I want to do is just wrap this in a try catch. So I'm going to say try to do something and then catch the results. If there's any kind of error, catch those results. So try catch. So I'm going to take all of this content down here and I'm going to whack that into our try, because we want to try to do this. And then if there are any errors, then I want to let's just whack loading down at the bottom. If there are any errors, then I want to set the error to error. So now our component will receive a loading state, it will receive data, and it will receive errors if there are any errors for whatever reason. So let's save this, come back over here, and let's just console log error. Clear the window, go to users, come back to posts, and we get our data, and loading true, error is null, data. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got exactly what we needed there. That's the actual useFetch all hooked up. So now what I want to do is just make sure that we're repeating that over on our users page. So just like we did here, we can pull off data, loading, and error from useFetch and give it a URL. I'm just going to do the exact same here. So get rid of all of this. I'm going to say const data, loading, and error I want from useFetch. So let's automatically import that. And now we obviously need the URL, but I've gone ahead and deleted it. So let's just quickly grab that data, save that there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log data here, but I'm going to say user data. Clear the window, go to users, and we get user data. Brilliant. Finally, what I'm going to do is just make sure that we are handling this our data, and we're rendering it to the screen. So what I'm going to say is if we're loading, then we want to obviously return like a loading state, and then otherwise we want to return a list of all of the data. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so how should we do this? Let's just whack this in a simple ternary. And what I'm going to say is if we're loading, then return loading. This is only temporary. We'll change this and make it a little bit more sophisticated in a second. And if we're not loading, let's just say results are in. So then I'm going to come back over to our window, and we get results are in, and we reload, and we get a quick flash on saying it's loading. Okay, so next what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock down onto a new line, and I'm going to let's just tidy this up a little bit because we're going to be using it. And then what I'm going to do, oh my god, we'll get there. Okay, so then what I'm going to say is if we're not loading, then I want to make a check, and I want to make sure that data is being returned, because obviously we set it to null because it could return like an array or an object or something. So I want to just say if data exists, so it's not null, and data dot length is greater than 0, then we want to render the results. And then what we could do is we could have a fallback, and we could say something like no data retrieved. Let's just leave it as no data. Okay, so results are in, and now what we can do is we can loop over our data. So I'm going to create a UL, and then let's have we'll loop over these. So I'll say data.map, and let's call this item. That makes sense. Item for every item. Then what I want to do is I want to return an li, and then for each li, I want to, let's just check the. Okay, we get an ID, we get a name. Okay, so let's just return a item dot name. This should work. Bear in mind I've not tested it. There we go. Okay, it's worked. So it's rendered out a list of everyone's users. It's just complaining that we've not provided a key to every li. So what we'll say is key is equal to item.id. Save this, come back, and let's just clear our window, go to posts, go to users, and it works. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got it working, we've got it rendering and looping over some data, and we can do the exact same on posts. Now, I'm not going to go through the steps because it's literally just a rinse and repeat of what we've just done with with users here, but we can literally just map over data, and then we can render it to the users. So I hope that makes sense. I suppose let's just quickly recap. Instead of using an effect and rendering it when this application loads, what we're doing is creating a custom hook called useFetch. That useFetch can be called anything, but we've called it useFetch so it falls in line with the React's native hooks. And then we're returning some variables from useFetch, so we can just deconstruct that out of useFetch. If I open up useFetch, what we're doing here is we are returning data loading an error, and that is all part of our state, which is up here. And then we've got a use effect. So when this first gets called, this use fetch, it's going to take in a URL, and that is going to be getting added to our dependency list. And then we're going to set our loading state when fetch data gets called, which is down here. We set it to true. We try and retrieve the results. And if we do retrieve the results, then we set the data to our content, which is just awaiting the response. And then if there are any errors, we can just set errors, and then finally we just set loading to false. So now what we can do is we can just go ahead and just use these three variables anywhere in our application, and we can just keep on reusing useFetch. So guys, if you do have any questions, as always, please feel free to like, comment, and please feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take it easy.